Welcome back to part 4 of 8 lectures on the coming 2026 financial and economic crisis. At the height of the global economic collapse of the 1930s, John Maynard Keynes raised a very fundamental question. For example, he asked, can we prevent an almost complete collapse of the financial structure of modern capitalism, with no financial leadership left in the world and profound intellectual error as to causes and cures prevailing in the responsible seats of power? One begins to wonder and to doubt. Whether the policies Keynes embraced would have significantly mitigated the effects of the Great Depression is arguable, as Keynes somehow failed to recognize the dynamics of land markets as a key driver of economic cycles. In one sense, however, Keynes was on the right track. He wrote, "Now, though this state of affairs would be quite compatible with some measure of individualism, yet it would mean the euthanasia of the rentier, and consequently the euthanasia of the cumulative oppressive power of the capitalist to exploit the scarcity value of capital. The owner of capital can obtain interest because capital is scarce, just as the owner of land can obtain rent because land is scarce." At the end of 1933, an open letter by Keynes to Franklin Roosevelt appeared in the New York Times. In this letter came the advice later to become the basis for the Keynesian revolution and what became known as demand management. As the prime mover in the first stage of the technique of recovery, I lay overwhelming emphasis on the increase of national purchasing power resulting from governmental expenditure, which is financed by loans and is not merely a transfer through taxation from existing incomes. Thus, here we have one of the most respected economists of that era calling upon government to borrow from those with monetary assets rather than requiring the wealthy to pay taxes sufficient to meet the financial needs of government. Conventional in much of his thinking, I have found no indication that Keynes ever considered authorizing government to use its sovereign power to create and directly inject money into circulation independent of debt issuance. Critiquing Keynes as Henry George might have, I believe Keynes exhibited short-sightedness by failing to distinguish between income earned by producing goods or providing needed and desired services and income derived from speculating in land and taking advantage of other rent-seeking privileges under law. However, as bursar of King's College, Keynes was well aware of both the opportunities and risks of investing in real estate. He writes, "One must not allow one's attitude to securities which have a daily market quotation to be disturbed by the fact or lose one's sense of proportion. Some bursars will buy without a tremor unquoted and unmarketable investments in real estate which, if they had a selling quotation for immediate case available at each audit, would turn their hair gray." Challenging the post-war Keynesians in 1951, Professor Harry Gunnison Brown raised very much the same arguments as might Henry George. Why do the writers in question consistently and persistently ignore the fact that some have to pay others for permission to work on and live on the earth in those locations where work is reasonably effective and life reasonably tolerable? Why do they always, or practically always, turn their attention to heavy taxation of incomes that are not at all exploitative, but are fairly earned by service given? Why do they thus, while stressing compulsory charity, insist on overlooking the fundamental requirements of justice? Why must they forever stress taxation that tends to weaken capitalist incentive or motivation and so make the free private enterprise system work less effectively, even if such taxation does not so far interfere with its successful operation as to completely discredit it and cause its ultimate abandonment? When a government borrows, one part of the policy choice is who ought to be taxed in order to raise at least a portion of the revenue necessary to service this debt. MMT argues that such taxes are appropriate to achieve social policy objectives, but are unnecessary to meet the revenue needs of government. I come down on the side of imposing a high rate of taxation on income that is unearned. If some earned income is also captured at the highest levels of income, I accept this as a modest price to pay for systemic reform in the direction of fairness and equity. More on this later. Governments also raise revenue by leasing parts of the public domain to private interests. Only rarely do the fees collected represent the full potential rental value of these locations or resource-laden tracts of land. For example, the federal grazing fee for 2022 is set at $1.35 per animal unit per month. A cow and her calf is considered one unit. This fee is not determined based on competitive bidding between potential users. Rather, the fee structure is established using a 1966 base fee, adjusted based on 1. Current private grazing land lease rates, 2. Beef cattle prices, and C. The cost of livestock production. The same outcome occurs with most other natural assets, such as allocation of frequencies on the broadcast spectrum. Most licenses were acquired at nominal cost. Only since 1994 has the FCC auctioned off licenses for available frequencies. The winning bidder obtains the right to use the spectrum freely as long as they adhere to all FCC guidelines and standards. The federal government currently occupies between 60 and 70% of the entire spectrum in the commercially most valuable range. A proposal now under consideration to obtain release of some frequencies is for the government to impose an internal charge on the department equal to the market rental value of the spectrum, reducing the department's budget. In 2015, Michael O'Reilly, Commissioner of the Federal Communications Commission, explained why, in his opinion, annual fee adjustments are not appropriate public policy. He stated, first, commercial spectrum users have already paid for their spectrum in one form or another. While some have purchased licenses at an FCC auction, others effectively paid for their spectrum when original licenses were made available on the secondary market. Second, many commercial spectrum holders are in the midst of spectrum reevaluations and subject to market pressures. Let me reread an important part of his comment. While some have purchased licenses at an FCC auction, others effectively paid for their spectrum when original licenses were made available on the secondary market. The very fact that there is a secondary market for such licenses tells us that the annual fee paid to the government, that is to the public, is far lower than the full annual rental value. The difference is then capitalized into a selling price for the license itself. Some states and the federal government do capture land rent in the form of royalties on the amount of oil and natural gas extracted. Record profits for the major oil and gas companies indicate that the rents, that is in the form of royalties, charged to the oil companies are far below what would be captured if there was ongoing competitive bidding for access to the public lands. Here is a chart of the royalty rates collected. A fundamental property rights question is whether a deed granting to the holder exclusive use of a location rightfully includes a claim of ownership to subsurface minerals or to land all the way to the center of the earth. Should I benefit financially if the land on which my residence is constructed also happens to contain valuable minerals? Scattered across the United States are long abandoned underground coal mines in areas that have become desirable commercial or industrial development properties. Because of the condition of these mines, subsidence is causing damage to buildings constructed on the surface. Who should be responsible for remediation today when there was no requirement for remediation when the mining company operated there? Let's take a look at the overall revenue side of the picture for the U.S. government. During 2021, the federal government took in nearly $3.5 trillion in revenue. Half of this came from individual income taxes. The tax structure is progressive in that the taxes paid by the top 1% equaled about 20% of the total paid. Note, however, that corporate income taxes amounted to just 7% of the total. The political debate over these revenue streams is, I believe, almost entirely ideological rather than based on sound economics or even fairness. The long-term trend has seen a steady decline not in dollars paid in taxes, but in the percentage share of GDP that comes from corporate income taxes. Here again comes the question of whether it is both fair and efficient to impose a tax on business profits. Of almost equal importance is whether it makes sense to create a tax code that is so complex that compliance requires an army of tax accountants and tax lawyers on the part of the taxpayers and the government. Is there not a better way? More on this later. City governments have resorted to a combination of increasing taxation and borrowing in order to meet their expenditures. A 2022 analysis by Adam McCann for WalletHub.com indicates that Atlanta now has the highest long-term debt per capita, followed by New York City, Nashville, San Francisco, and Washington, D.C. Arguably, sound tax policies would allow these cities to retire their debt, balance their budgets, and allocate funds for state-of-the-art public infrastructure and amenities. Municipalities are not sovereign currency issuers, so their revenue must come from the property located within their borders, from their residents, from the businesses operating there, and people employed there but who live elsewhere. Almost no municipal governments have figured out the key to balancing budgets while creating the right climate for non-inflationary full employment. The question this raises is whether it might be possible for cities and states to actually collect revenue from various sources that exceed annual budget requirements in order to build a capital fund to be drawn on for the construction of capital projects. Would a shift to the public capture of rents make this possible? Historically, states and cities have looked to the federal government for a sharing of revenue. Intergovernmental revenue coming from the federal government over the last 4 decades has been possible only by debt-based monetary expansion. Of course, as MMT analysts observe, this debt could be eliminated with a few keystrokes on the government's computer, although there are dangers associated with such a huge, immediate infusion of cash into the hands of the bondholders. Would it automatically cause inflation? Almost certainly. The prices of corporate shares of stock and real estate would be pulled upward as this money moved from fixed income assets into equities and property. We seem to move from one systemic shock to another, responding, whether the problem is a pandemic or ever more frequent natural disasters, requires sums of money. Only the federal government today has the authority to create new monetary units needed so these systemic shocks can be adequately responded to. Income supplements to people who have lost employment caused by systemic crisis is certainly warranted and necessary. As Keynes argued, government must step in when private sector spending contracts and millions of people lose their income. Systemic failure repeats because the policies and programs we employ in response to systemic shock fail to remove the fundamental cause of economic cycles. Henry George could not muster the political support for systemic reform. More tragically, those who agreed with him had an extremely difficult time getting a hearing in the decades following Henry George's death. This was also the case within academe. One voice that did come through, at least to some degree, was that of economics professor Harry Gunnison Brown. Harry Gunnison Brown authored an economic textbook that went through many editions in the early to mid-20th century. He was one of the few professors of economics of his era with a sound understanding of land markets and the impact of taxation policies on the economic cycle, insights he acquired in large measure by the study of the works of Henry George. In his analysis of the causes of the Great Depression, Brown concluded, "To those now guiding the affairs of our country, it is either a matter of no importance at all, or else it is a matter for congratulation, that a majority of our people must pay a minority for the very permission to work on and live on the earth, in any except extremely undesirable locations." Thus, Brown expected very little of real consequence from the Roosevelt administration and its cadre of economic advisors. He wrote, "The fact that the masses of our people, from one end of our country to the other, must pay heavy taxes in their food and clothing bills in order to relieve landowners of taxes on the community-produced value of their land does not seem to concern them." Brown was resurrecting Henry George's arguments against all taxation save for the public collection of rents via the taxing authority. Doing so would remove the burden of taxation that, as this poster says, binds the people. Again, the challenge was, and still is, to get government to recognize under law the distinction between income earned by producing goods and providing services, and income derived by privileges secured and protected by unjust law. In a paper Brown wrote that was published in 1936 by the American Academy of Political and Social Science, he challenged his fellow analysts to consider the very real benefits of collecting location rents as a primary source of public revenue. I find that I am sometimes spoken of as a single taxer by persons who are opposed to the single tax, while some of the thoroughgoing single taxers profess themselves not wholly satisfied with my orthodoxy. The truth is that I recognize the fundamental justice and common sense of the single tax idea, but that any other tax than a tax on land values is always and everywhere wrong, regardless of public needs or the nature of this other tax, I do not maintain. What he said reminds me of the saying, "The perfect is the enemy of the good." Those who work for legislative change to achieve reforms must constantly ask whether incremental change in the right direction is the best that can be done, or does a direct and vocal public attack on the system get faster and more fundamental result. Schooled at Yale under Irving Fisher, Brown embraced incrementalism without challenging the underlying analysis provided by Henry George. But that the annual rental value of land should be eventually almost entirely appropriated by the public in taxation, and that it should be the chief source, even though not necessarily the only source of public revenue, I am thoroughly convinced.